Okay. Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. I'm Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host, Tigran Sloyan.
Hey, Sophia. Excited to be back here talking about data-driven recruiting. Today's topic is how to avoid bias while measuring skills. And the reason this is so important is that, like we talked in one of the first episodes, so like one of the main reasons to start going beyond resumes and to start doing data-driven recruiting is to eliminate bias. And as we know, there is a lot of bias in recruiting processes. But I think if you're not careful, it's very easy to introduce other types of biases while you migrate to like more data-driven ways of recruiting.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Yeah. So where do we start?
Where do we start? So I guess I'll explain what I mean like by introducing other type of bias. So what do you do when you're doing data-driven recruiting? You're trying to measure skills directly. So instead of relying on resume, instead of relying on pedigree, you're basically trying to measure skills directly, and you're trying to introduce assessments, right? So if you're trying to introduce something that we often refer to like a flight simulator for whatever job you're hiring for, you need to be careful with how you're framing those assessments, right? So like if you're introducing a question, like let's say you're introducing a programming question, like a coding task for somebody to complete, it's very easy to frame that task into a context that's biasing against a certain demographic, right?
Okay. So do you have any examples of?
Sure, yeah. I guess I can actually give you an example that happened elsewhere, and that's been an interesting learning. That a couple of years ago, there was yet another scandal related to the SATs, which are like standardized assessments, trying to create an objective and a level playing field for all university students. There was a conversation around, are the SAT questions biased, right? Like, are there questions, for example, some of the reading comprehension questions or the writing topics that are biasing against a certain demographic? And the conversation started with, like, do we have too many topics that are about football? Do we have too many topics that are about playing poker? And things that, certain demographics might be more interested in than others. And of course, if you're more interested or more familiar with the topic, you instantly have an advantage. If you're not, you're instantly at a disadvantage.
Yeah. So it's kind of about trying to avoid a topic that only certain group of people have higher familiarity level with. And then kind of introducing more general topic that are applicable for covering most of the population.
Exactly.
So so how do we start? So should we have kind of a governing body like who reviews like whether or not kind of as a checkpoint, like one person writes or comes up with the topics, and then there is another kind of an independent body reviewing whether or not those topics are covering most of the population or not?
Yeah, well, ideally you would have a team of professionals who've done it, right? Like a team of professionals who have designed an assessment that you can leverage instead of doing it internally, because if you're going to do it internally, you need the training, you need the equal opportunity compliance training, you need somebody who really understands what they're doing in terms of designing your assessments and designing your questions. And like there's a lot of places that it can go wrong, right? Like we do this a lot with software engineering assessments. I can give you a clear example from there.
Sure.
A lot of the times when companies want to do data-driven recruiting and they introduce an assessment as part of their engineering hiring practices, right? The standard flow is to say like, hey, one of our engineers who's been here for a long time, let's just ask them to create a question. And that engineer unintentionally is going to create a question about something that they know.
And in this situation, likely that there isn't any formal training on how to design an assessment or what is equal employment guidelines that he has to or she has to comply with. Because it's often usually like, hey, like we need a test. Can you work on it? Like you know how to program. Can you write a question that asks us about how to program?
Right.
Okay.
And as we know, the current state of for example, software engineers is heavily skewed towards a certain demographic. And if you ask that specific demographic to design a test without really knowing like how to create something that doesn't bias against others, you just end up reinforcing that same vicious cycle,
Right.
where a lot of coding assessment questions would be about chess, would be about video games, and that of course is in of itself contains bias.
Right.
So one way we've found, which has been very interesting and effective, is to make the questions be about programming. Because if you're interviewing somebody for a software engineering job, the only thing you're sure that they're supposed to know and are expected to know is computer programming, right?
Yeah.
So if the question itself is about computer programming, such as the context of the question could be like, hey, you're building a new programming language, and as part of this programming language, you're trying to build a new data structure or build a new function type, right?
Right.
You know that this person is expected to know programming.
Right.
So by using this type of context, you're not introducing extra bias.
Right.
Whereas if you said, hey, you're building chess, or you're playing chess and you're trying to design an AI for chess, those who know chess, which is again a biased group of people,
Right.
would have an advantage over those who don't. And this is not only an issue for just having an unbiased hiring process, but it's also a compliance problem, because especially for larger companies who have to ensure that they are EEOC compliant, if your questions have some sort of a context like this that is favoring certain demographics and not others,
Right.
you're going to run into issues sooner or later.
Right. If you have evidence that you're systemically discriminating certain demographics.
Intentional or unintentionally?
Yeah,
Most of the time
it's
unintentional.
yeah, and I think that's the more scary one, because we do it without even realizing that we're doing it, right? But yeah, that can be a big no-no from the HR and legal team like, coming after you. All right, sounds good. So what's the bottom line here?
The bottom line is that bias has many shapes and forms, and it's very easy to replace one type of bias with another. So I think we advocate a lot for removing bias, doing data-driven recruiting, but as you start doing that, as you start moving into that world, you have to remember that it's very easy to remove pedigree bias and introduce other types of bias. So you have to constantly keep in mind that bias doesn't come in one form. It has many shapes and forms.
Right. And you either have a proper training and support for be able to create questions that are not biased internally, or kind of utilize the third-party experts who are trained on this topic already.
Exactly.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, thanks for the insights, and thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time.